Silas Rook was sanding the edge of an old pine board when the knock came. It was not a proper knock. It was one weak tap. Then another. Then the sound of something small falling against the door. Silas stopped moving. The board across his workbench read, "Old Mercy Stage Station." Half the letters were fresh. The rest still needed black paint. The station had been empty for years. Sitting out by the old road with one wall leaning and the roof losing shingles. Folks in Harlan Crossing wanted the sign fixed before the county talked about opening the stage route again. Silas did not care much about stage routes. He cared about clean edges, straight nails, and work that kept his hands busy. The knock came again. This time, lower. Silas set down the sandpaper and walked to the door. His right knee ached with every step. It always did when the air held dust before rain. He opened the door. A girl stood on his porch. No. Not stood. She was trying to stand. She could not have been more than 10. Her dress was covered in road dust. One sleeve had been tied up with a strip of cloth. Her hair hung loose around her face. And her bare feet were gray from the old stage road. In one hand, she held a broken spur. In the other, a folded letter. She looked up at Silas with eyes too steady for a child. "Are you Silas Rook?" she asked. "I am. My father said to find you." Then her knees gave way. Silas caught her before she hit the porch boards. He had not carried a child in a long time. The weight of her in his arms hit him hard. But he did not let it show. He brought her inside and laid her on the long bench near the window. The shop smelled of pine, oil, and old coffee. Outside, wind moved dust along the road. Silas brought water first. Then bread. Then a clean cloth. He did not crowd her. He set everything where she could reach it and pulled his stool back a few feet. "What's your name?" he asked. "Maren Holt." Her voice was dry and small. "Red Spur Range." She nodded once. Silas knew the name. Everybody in the county knew Red Spur. Western pasture. Good horse land. A wild mustang band that had kept men arguing for years. "Who sent you?" "My father. Elias Holt." Silas looked at the folded letter on the bench. Maren followed his eyes. "You can read it," she said. "He said you would know what to do." Silas picked up the letter. The paper was worn at the corners and sealed badly. Like someone had closed it in a hurry. His name was written on the front in a careful hand. He broke the seal and read. Elias Holt wrote plain. He said his brother, Benton Holt, was trying to take Red Spur Range. He said the West pasture and the Mustang herd belonged to Elias and his heirs. He said the county records had been twisted, and that the real proof was hidden at the ranch. Not just a will. A brand book. A survey map. A page showing the Mustangs were tied to the Western Range. Not to Benton's claim. Silas read slower when he reached the last lines. "If Maren brings the broken spur, Benton knows about the brand book. Do not send her back. I named you guardian because Ida Vane said you were still a man who kept his word." Silas lowered the letter. For a moment. The shop was quiet, except for the dust ticking against the window. Maren watched him carefully. "Are you going to send me to Sheriff Creed?" she asked. "Yes." Her face went still. Silas folded the letter. "But not alone. And not yet." She breathed then. "Just a little." He looked at the broken spur in her hand. It was old iron. Snapped at the neck. One rowel missing. "Why did your father give you that?" "He didn't." Maren said. "I took it from the tack room." "Why?" "Because it was my mother's. And because Benton said a girl had no claim to horses." Silas leaned back on the stool. That told him enough. He stood and went to the back wall, where his carpenter's tools hung in a neat row. Then he took down his coat and reached for the old lantern. Maren sat up too fast. "You're going now?" "Soon." "To Red Spur?" "Yes." She gripped the broken spur tighter. "I know the way in." "I figured you did. There's a window on the west side of the tack room. It doesn't latch. The third board on the left wall comes loose. Silas looked at her. This was not a child guessing. This was a child who had been planning while adults failed her. He took the letter and tucked it inside his coat. Then we go after dark, he said. Maren looked toward the door, where the old stage road ran east through the dust. And if Benton's men are already there? Silas lifted the unfinished stage station sign from the bench and leaned it against the wall. Then we keep quiet, he said. And we get the truth before they do. Outside, thunder moved somewhere beyond Red Spur Range. They left after the moon rose. Silas did not take the main road. The old stage road ran east in a clean line toward Red Spur Range. But clean lines were for daylight and honest business. That night, Silas led Maren through the dry wash south of the road, where sagebrush leaned over the banks, and the ground held wagon ruts from years nobody remembered clearly. Maren walked beside him with the broken spur wrapped in a handkerchief and tucked into her dress pocket. Silas had given her his late wife's dark shawl. It hung too large on her shoulders. She did not complain. The storm had not broken yet. It sat low beyond the hills, pressing the air flat. Far off, lightning showed the outline of Red Spur Range, then left it black again. How far? Silas asked. Another half-mile, Maren said. Then the wash bends north. You sure? I grew up there. She said it without pride. More like a fact she no longer trusted to mean safety. Silas kept his pace slow enough for her, though he knew she was trying not to limp. He did not tell her to stop. He had learned long ago that people carrying fear sometimes needed dignity more than comfort. They reached the back line of Red Spur near midnight. The ranch lay quiet under the dark. The main house stood on a rise, square and pale. The barn sat lower, with the tack room built against its west side. Beyond it, the holding pens were empty, except for a few shadows of horses shifting in their sleep. Maren crouched behind a split-rail fence. Silas lowered himself beside her, his bad knee protesting. Bunkhouse, he whispered. She pointed. East side. 2 men inside most nights. Benton keeps Rafe Dodd near the house. Milt Sayer checks the barn when he remembers. Dog. Copper. By the kitchen door. She paused. He knows me. That help us? No. If he hears me, he'll come. Silas nodded. They waited. A lantern moved once near the main house, then vanished. A door opened. A man stepped out, stood on the porch, and looked over the yard. Maren went very still. Silas did not ask if it was Benton. He knew by the way she stopped breathing. The man on the porch drank from a cup, watched the dark like he owned it, then went back inside. Maren closed her eyes for 1 second. Then she opened them. Now, they moved low along the fence line, crossed behind the horse trough, and reached the tack room wall. The west window was small and warped. Maren put both hands beneath the frame and pushed. It lifted with a soft wooden sigh. Silas held his breath. No shout came. No dog barked. He lifted Maren through first. She dropped inside without a sound. A moment later, she opened the tack room door from within just wide enough for him to pass. Inside, the smell was leather, dust, horse sweat, and old rope. Silas waited for his eyes to adjust. Saddles hung along one wall, bridles on pegs. A row of old brand irons leaned in a corner. The place had the quiet of rooms that remembered better men. Third board, Maren whispered. She moved to the left wall. Silas followed. He counted from the corner. 1, 2, 3. The board looked no different from the others. He pressed it. It shifted. Maren let out a sound so small, it was almost not there. Silas worked his fingers under the edge and eased the board free. Behind it sat a tin box, flat and dark, wedged between 2 studs. He pulled it out. Maren reached for it with both hands, then stopped herself. You take it, she said. Silas looked at her. That was not fear. That was Truss trying to stand on new legs. He took the box and set it on a feed crate. The latch opened with a quiet click. Inside were papers wrapped in oilcloth. A will. A survey map. And a brand book with the Red Spur mark burned into the cover. Silas turned the first pages by lantern light. Every mare. Every colt. Every year. The western pasture listed in Silas Holt's name. The mustang herd tied to that range by date. Brand. And witness. Your father was careful. Silas said. Maren touched the edge of the book. He said horses don't lie. Men do. Outside. Voices crossed the yard. Silas closed the box at once. Two men came around the barn. Their boots slow on hard ground. Benton wants the house cleared before morning. One said. Cleared of what? Papers. Anything Elias kept. The other man spat into the dirt. Too late if the girl took it. She's 10. She ran scared. She knew enough to run. Maren pressed back against the wall. Silas stood between her and the door. The men stopped outside the tack room. A lantern lifted near the window. Light spilled thin across the floorboards. Maren did not move. Silas did not breathe. Then one of the horses in the barn stamped hard. And the man with the lantern cursed under his breath. Just horses. The other said. Come on. Benton wants a rider sent to the land office at first light. The lantern moved away. The voices faded toward the house. Silas waited until the yard was quiet again before he touched Maren's shoulder. If go. She nodded once. They slipped out through the window and crossed back toward the wash. Only when the ranch was behind them did Maren speak. My father isn't coming back. Is he? Silas looked toward the dark line of hills. He could have lied. He did not. I don't know. He said. Maren held the broken spur through the cloth in her pocket. But Benton knows. She whispered. Silas tucked the tin box tight under his coat. Ahead of them. Lightning opened the sky for one pale second. And the old stage road showed itself like a scar through the dark. Dawn found them at Ida Vane's place. Her house sat beyond a line of cottonwoods. Low and square. With a porch that leaned but did not give. A shotgun rested beside the door. Ida herself stood in the doorway before Silas had tied the mare. She was old. Thin. And straight-backed. With gray hair pinned hard behind her head. I wondered if Elias's girl would make it to you. She said. Maren stood behind Silas. One hand on the tin box. Ida looked at her. And her face softened without changing much. Come in. Child. Inside. The house smelled of coffee and biscuits. Ida did not fuss. She did not ask Maren to tell the story twice. She simply set food on the table. Poured water. And listened while Silas opened the tin box. The brand book lay between them. Ida touched the red spur mark on the cover. Elias kept his records, better than most men keep their Bible. She said. He trusted you with the letter. Silas said. He trusted me because I was old enough not to be frightened by Benton Holt's name. Maren looked down. Ida reached into a drawer and took out a folded paper. I wrote what I saw when Maren came to me yesterday. Time. Condition. What she carried. What she said. Signed it twice. In case one signature made a coward nervous. Silas took the paper. We'll need Dr. Shaw. He's already awake by now. They rode into Harlan Crossing before the sun had burned the blue from the morning. Dr. Mercer Shaw's office stood beside the barber shop. He was a narrow man with silver spectacles and a careful way of moving. As if every action had already been measured. He examined Maren quietly. Silas waited by the stove. Hat in his hands. Ida waited near the door. Maren did not cry. She answered every question in a flat, steady voice that made Silas's hands close once around the brim of his hat. When Dr. Shaw finished, he washed his hands and sat at his desk. I will write what I observed. He said. No more. No less. That's all we need. Silas said. The doctor's pen moved over the paper. Marks of mistreatment. He wrote. Exhaustion. Evidence of recent flight on foot. Patient states she came from Red Spur Range. He sanded the ink. Signed his name. And folded the statement. Then he looked at Maren. You are not going back there today. Maren looked at Silas. Silas said. No. Only then did she nod. Sheriff Amos Creed's office stood across from the land office. Which was not an accident. Men in Harland Crossing often made trouble with paper before they made it with pistols. Sheriff Creed was at his desk when they came in. He had a broad face. Tired eyes. And a badge scratched dull from years of dust and weather. A coffee cup sat near his elbow. He did not look surprised. That worried Silas more than if he had. Silas. Creed said. Amos. The sheriff's eyes moved to Maren. This the Holt girl. This is Maren Holt. Silas said. Elias Holt's daughter. I heard she was missing. From Benton. Creed did not answer quickly enough. Silas stepped to the desk and laid the oilcloth packet down. One by one. He set out the papers. Elias's letter. Ida's statement. Dr. Shaw's report. The will. The survey map. The brand book. The broken spur came last. Maren placed it on the desk herself. Creed looked at it. What is that supposed to prove? Maren's voice was quiet. That my mother rode Red Spur before Benton ever claimed it. The sheriff looked at her then. Really looked. Silas saw the moment the office changed. Not enough. Not yet. But the room had shifted. Creed opened the will and read. Then, the survey map. Then the brand book. He took longer with the brand book. Benton came to my house last night. Creed said at last. I figured. He says Elias ran debts through the western pasture and left the girl confused. Elias left records. Silas said. Benton left talk. Creed leaned back. Benton Holt has money. So does the bank. That doesn't make it family. Ida stepped forward. Amos. I have known you since your mother sent you to church with one shoe untied. Do not sit there and tell me your badge only works when the accused man is poor. The sheriff's jaw tightened. Silas did not smile. Creed looked again at Maren. Did your father name Silas Rook your guardian? Maren pointed to the last page. There. Creed read it. Then he set the paper down. Legal enough to stand until a judge says otherwise. He said. For today. That is enough. Silas answered. The sheriff stood and reached for his hat. I'll file emergency notice. Then we ride to Red Spur and serve Benton proper. Maren's grip tightened around the broken spur. Outside. A boy from the livery ran across the street and burst through the open door. Sheriff. He said. Breathing hard. Land office just opened. Creed turned. The boy swallowed. Benton Holt is inside with a leather case full of papers. Silas looked through the window. Across the street. The land office door stood open. And in its shadow, a man in a clean dark coat was smiling like he had arrived first. Benton Holt stepped out of the land office like a man leaving church. Clean coat. Clean gloves. Hat settled square. A leather document case under one arm. He looked across the street at Sheriff Creed's office and smiled. Not wide. Not warm. Just enough to let them know he had expected them. Maren stood beside Silas at the window. Her fingers closed around the broken spur until her knuckles went pale. That's him. She said. Silas did not ask if she was sure. A person knew the shape of the thing they feared. Sheriff Creed came to the window. Looked once. And reached for his hat. Stay here. Silas turned. Amos. I said, stay here. If Benton is filing papers against that will, you need the brand book beside you. I need this town not to become a circus before noon. Ida Vane gave a dry sound from the corner. Too late. The elephant is already in the land office. Creed looked at her. Then, at Silas. 5 minutes. Let me see what he filed. The sheriff crossed the street. Every door on the block had gone quiet. The barber stopped sweeping. Two men outside the feed store turned their bodies just enough to watch without admitting they were watching. The telegraph line hummed in the wind above the road. Benton saw Creed coming and lifted the leather case. Like a gift. Like a challenge. Maren stepped back from the window. He is making another story. Silas looked at her. That's what he does. She said. He puts papers on tables and tells people what they mean before anyone else can read them. Silas heard something in that. Not just fear. Experience. He lowered his voice. Then we make sure somebody reads them slow. The back door opened before Maren could answer. A young man slipped inside. Hat in hand. Breathing like he had walked fast and tried not to be seen doing it. Silas turned. The man could not have been more than 20. Dust on his trousers. Red mark from a saddle strap across his vest. One eye toward the window. One toward the door. Ida knew him first. Lute Ansel. The young man swallowed. Ma'am. Silas said. You ride for Benton. I worked Red Spur 3 months. Lute looked at Maren and his face changed. Shame. Maybe. Or the first honest thing after too much silence. I need to speak to the sheriff. He's across the street. Silas said. I can't go out there. Rafe Dodd's near the livery. Milt Sayers watching the office. Maren went still. Silas noticed. Lute took off his hat. I saw men ride after Silas Holt on the Cheyenne Road. Benton said it was business. It wasn't business. The room hardened around those words. Ida stood straighter. Silas did not move toward the young man. He kept his voice even. You willing to say that to Creed? Yes. You willing to sign it? Lute looked toward the land office. That's why I came. Maren's eyes were fixed on him. You saw my father. Lute looked at the floor. I saw enough to know I should have spoken sooner. Maren did not answer. That silence cut deeper than any accusation could have. Silas pulled out Creed's chair. Sit. When the sheriff comes back. You tell him exactly that. Across the street. The land office door opened. Creed came out with his jaw set hard. Benton followed. Still holding the leather case. The sheriff crossed back faster than he had gone. He entered the office and stopped when he saw Lute. You picked a morning. Creed said. Lute stood. I have a statement. Creed looked from Lute to Silas. Then to Maren. For Silas Holt. Yes. Sir. Creed took one breath. Sit down. The statement took less than 10 minutes to write, and longer to survive. Lute spoke of horses saddled before dawn. Of Benton's trusted men leaving by the Cheyenne Road. Of Silas not returning. Of Benton ordering papers gathered before anyone from town could ask questions. Maren sat by the wall. Her hands folded in her lap. She did not cry. That was worse. When Lute finished, Creed sanded the ink and signed as witness. Then the telegraph key began clicking down the street. Silas looked toward the sound. Benton was walking to the telegraph office, with a leather case in his hand. Creed swore under his breath. Ida took one step forward. What did he file? A settlement claim. Creed said. Old judge's seal. Says Silas gave up Western pasture rights 18 months ago. That's a lie. Maren said. I believe you. Creed said. But if he wires it to Laramie first. The court may freeze the claim until a circuit judge rides in. How long? Silas asked. Weeks. Maren stood. In weeks. He'll move the mustangs. Nobody contradicted her. Silas looked at the brand book on the desk. The red spur mark stared back from the worn leather cover. Then Maren spoke again. Quieter. He is not going to stop. Not unless we make him. Silas looked through the window. Benton reached the telegraph office door and turned once. As if he knew they were watching. Silas picked up the tin box. No. Creed said. You do not run across that street. I wasn't planning to run. What are you planning? Silas put on his hat. To walk slow enough that the whole town sees what we are carrying. Silas stepped out first. He did not hurry. The tin box was under one arm. The brand book rested on top of it. The red spur mark facing the street. Behind him came Sheriff Creed with loot statement folded in his hand. Ida Vane followed with her, chin lifted like a woman walking into church. Maren came last. Silas looked back once. You can stay inside. Maren shook her head. No. She said. He always counts on me being hidden. So, Silas waited until she stood beside him. Not behind. Beside. The street had gone still. Men stood under awnings. A woman paused at the pump with her bucket half full. Ray Tibbs leaned in the livery doorway. One hand on the frame. At the far end. Benton Holt had reached the telegraph office. He turned when he heard the sheriff's boots on the boards. Amos. Benton called. I'm sending notice to Laramie. Nothing improper in that. Creed kept walking. You filed a settlement claim this morning. A lawful one. Then you will not mind it being read in open daylight beside the will. The brand book. And the girl's witness. Benton's smile thinned. Maren felt the whole street looking at her. Her hand moved to her pocket. Where the broken spur lay wrapped in cloth. She held it through the fabric. Rafe Dodd came out from beside the livery. Milt Sayer stepped from the alley near the feed store. Neither man raised his voice. Neither needed to. They only moved enough to narrow the street. Silas saw it. So did Creed. Rafe. The sheriff said. Stand down. Rafe looked past him to Benton. Benton said nothing. That was answer enough. A sudden crack split the front window of the sheriff's office behind them. Glass jumped from the frame and scattered across the floor inside. For one long second. Nobody breathed. Then the whole town drew back at once. Silas moved without thinking. He put one hand near Maren's shoulder. Not pushing her down. Only ready. Creed turned toward the broken window. Ida Vane stayed exactly where she was. Her voice cut through the street. That was your mistake. Benton Holt. Benton's face stayed smooth. But his eyes sharpened. Creed looked toward Milt Sayer, who stood near the feed store with his hand still low at his side. Milt Sayer. Creed called. His voice carrying from storefront to storefront. You are under arrest for firing on a sheriff's office. Milt froze. Rafe looked ready to move. Then Ray Tibbs stepped out from the livery and stood in the open. Frankly, he was not much to look at. Thin shoulders. Dusty apron. One bad eye from an old horse kick. But he stood there. Then the barber came to his doorway. Then the blacksmith. Then two ranch hands who had been pretending not to watch. The street changed. Not loud. Just enough. Benton saw it happen. He had spent years owning men one at a time. He had not planned on a whole street deciding it had seen enough. Creed crossed to Milt and took him by the arm. Milt did not fight. Rafe backed away from the livery wall. Benton looked at Silas. You have turned a family matter into a public show. Silas held the tin box tighter. No. You did that when you tried to bury a child's name under false paper. Maren stepped forward. Silas almost stopped her. Then he did not. She walked until she stood in the center of the road. Small under the high white sky. Dust at the hem of her dress. She took out the broken spur and unwrapped it. The iron caught the sun. This was my mother's. She said. Her voice was not loud. But the street was quiet enough to carry it. My father kept the brand book because he knew men would lie over land. He kept the survey because he knew men would lie over water. He sent me to Silas Rook because he knew my uncle would lie over me. Benton's face hardened. Maren looked at him. Where's my father? No one moved. The question hung over the street heavier than heat. Benton did not answer. Creed turned fully toward him. Benton Holt. The sheriff said. You are coming with me. For obstruction of lawful proceedings. False filing pending review. And conspiracy in the attack on this office. Benton looked at the people watching. Then at Rafe. Then at Milt in Creed's grip. For the first time. The smile left his face. He set the leather case on the hitching rail. Creed crossed the street and took him into custody himself. Maren did not look away. Only when Benton was led past her did her hand tremble. Silas stepped beside her. Not in front. Beside. She handed him the broken spur. He closed his hand around it gently. The telegraph key inside the office fell silent. But the case was not finished. Not yet. The will still had to stand before a judge. The brand book still had to be read into record. Elias Holt still needed the truth spoken over his name. And Red Spur Range still waited beyond the dust, with its mustangs running under a sky that had not decided whether to rain. Judge Ezra Bell arrived from Laramie 11 days later. He came in a black coat gray with trail dust, carrying a leather satchel and the look of a man who had read too many lies written in careful ink. By noon, Sheriff Creed's office was full. Maren sat in the chair before the desk. Silas stood behind her, one hand resting on the chair back. On the desk lay the will, the survey map, the brand book, Ida Vane's statement, Dr. Shaw's report, Lute Ansell's sworn account, and Benton Holt's settlement papers. Judge Bell read everything once. Then he read Benton's papers again. The room stayed quiet except for paper turning and the faint tap of the telegraph line outside. At last, the judge removed his spectacles. The settlement filed by Benton Holt is not valid, he said. Elias Holt was not properly notified. The Western Range was concealed from the proceeding by deliberate omission. The original will stands. Maren's hands tightened in her lap. Judge Bell looked at her. Red Spur Range, the Western pasture, the main house, and the mustang herd passed to Maren Holt, daughter and lawful heir of Elias Holt. No one spoke. Maren did not smile. The words were too large for that. Judge Bell turned to the county recorder, who stood near the door with his book under one arm. Strike Benton Holt's settlement claim from the county record. Mark it void pending charges of fraudulent filing. Then enter the corrected title. The recorder opened his book on Sheriff Creed's desk. His pen scratched across the page. Maren Holt. Owner, Silas Rook. Legal guardian until majority, Elias Holt. Lawful holder of Red Spur Range at time of death. Maren watched every letter appear. Benton had tried to bury her father under paper. Now paper had brought his name back into daylight. Judge Bell continued. Until Maren Holt reaches legal age, Silas Rook is confirmed as guardian of person and property. Red Spur is not to be sold, leased, divided, or transferred without court review. Sheriff Creed nodded once. And the mustangs? Maren asked. The judge touched the brand book. Your father made a special note regarding them. He said they were the last free thing left on the range. Then they will remain tied to that range. Judge Bell said. The western pasture and herd are placed under protected trust until you come of age. Maren looked up. A trust? It means no man can sell them while you are still a child. Her breath moved once. Uneven, but controlled. And Benton? Sheriff Creed answered. He waits for trial. So do the men who helped him. Your father's death is still under investigation. That part will take longer. Maren looked down. Silas wanted to give her something better. But truth was all he had. So he let the truth stand. Before Judge Bell left, he gave Sheriff Creed one more order. Benton's men were to leave Red Spur by sundown. The ranch keys, account papers, and all remaining stock records were to be delivered to Silas Rook. No more locked doors against this child, the judge said. That evening, Harlan Crossing held a church supper. Not a celebration, exactly. More like a town trying, late and awkward, to stand where it should have stood sooner. Ida Vane brought Maren a plate and said to the room. This is Maren Holt of Red Spur Range. Not orphan. Not ward. Not poor child. Maren Holt. Silas saw Maren hear the difference. 2 days later, they rode to Red Spur. The house was quiet. Too quiet. But Benton's men were gone. A deputy waited by the gate and handed Silas the keys without ceremony. In the wagon bed lay Silas's carpenter toolbox. Not all his belongings. just enough to show he was not leaving Maren to learn the place alone. The mustangs moved along the western fence line, dusty and restless under a pale morning sky. Silas carried a new board from the wagon. Maren carried the broken spur. Together, they walked to the old gate. Silas had painted the letters the night before. Slow and clean. Red Spur Mustang Trust, held from Maren Holt. He lifted the sign into place. Maren handed him the nails. Then Silas stopped and gave her the hammer. You set the first one. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she drove the nail herself. The sound went across the pasture. Sharp. Small. Enough. When the sign was firm, Maren took the broken spur and hung it beneath the board with a strip of rawhide. It no longer looked like something broken. It looked like something remembered. Silas opened his toolbox and set it at the foot of the gatepost. Then he took the brand book from under his coat and held it out to Maren. Your father's record, he said. She took it with both hands. For a while, she only held it. Then she carried it into the house and placed it on the main table, where Benton had once tried to make every paper serve him. Now the book belonged where it should, at the center of Red Spur. Outside, the mustangs began to move. First one, then 3. Then the whole band running along the western pasture. Manes lifted by the wind. Maren came back to the gate and stood beside Silas. After a while, she said, Will you teach me how to keep all this? Silas looked at the sign. The pasture. The horses. And the child Elias Holt had trusted to the world. Yes, he said. One day at a time. The wind moved through the gate. The broken spur turned softly under the sign. If this trail stayed with you, leave your thoughts for dust trail stories. Some promises are not loud. They are kept in dust, paper, wood, and the sound of horses still running free. This is a fictional story created for entertainment. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.